Today I'm going to show you how to replace the front brakes and rotors on this 2016 Ford Focus. Okay, once you got the car raised up and securely supported on jack stands, go ahead and remove the front wheels. Next step is to remove this spring clip. Just take a pair of needle nose pliers, grab it, pull it out of the caliper. Just like that. Rotate the steering wheel so that the caliper is facing out towards you. Now the caliper slide pins are housed inside of these rubber boots. There's one on the top, one on the bottom. They're closed off with these plastic caps. Stick a flat blade screwdriver, get under the cap and pry it out. Then loosen the slide pins using a 7mm hex head or Allen head socket. You don't have to completely remove the slide pin, just leave it inside its boot. Just make sure it's disconnected from the caliper bracket. At this point you should be able to just grab the caliper and pull it off. The rear pad will stay with the caliper. We'll leave that in for right now because we're going to use it to compress the caliper piston back in. To compress the caliper piston back in, you're going to use a C-clamp. Just make sure that this end of the C-clamp is against something flat and it's not pinching on any kind of rubber line or hose or bleeder screw or anything. Doesn't take very much force to compress the caliper piston, so as soon as you feel a little resistance, do not continue forcing. This is just an aluminum caliper and it can break. Now you pull that old pad out just by pulling on either side. It's got these spring clips that feed it in there. Now you do not want to let the caliper hang by its brake hose, because that could damage it. So take some wire or rope or something and use it to tie the caliper up. Just like that. The old brake pad out of there. This one was very, very close. There's like almost nothing left. If you're also replacing the rotor, you have to remove the caliper bracket as well. If you're just replacing the pads, you don't need to. The caliper bracket is held in with two 18mm bolts on the back of the steering knuckle. These bolts are pretty tight, so I recommend using a fairly large breaker bar. And once they're broken loose, I just run them out with the ratchet. At this point you can just pull the rotor right off. Depending on what climate you're in, your rotor might be rusted on. In that case, what you do is just take some PB Blaster and spray the backside as best you can. While rotating the hub, just spray and rotate. And in some cases, some taps with a rubber-faced hammer to the back side of the rotor will loosen it up too. Okay, I got both rotors off and they're ready to go to the machine shop. Now some auto parts stores will resurface the rotor for you, and it's significantly cheaper than buying new rotors. So definitely explore that option before you just buy new rotors. Okay, the rotors are back from the machine shop. Now whether you bought new rotors or you had your existing rotors turned, you're going to have to clean them with some brake cleaner. New rotors ship with a thin layer of oil on the rotor surface to prevent rusting while in storage. Best way to get that off is take some brake cleaner, put it on some cardboard, and then just soak the rotor and then just scrub with the cardboard. Don't worry about getting everything off in this step, because you'll do a final spray down once it's on the car. Same thing for the back of the rotor. Alright, now we can begin reassembly. The brake rotor has a tendency to want to fall back off, and it makes it difficult to put the caliper back on. So what I do is just take one of the lug nuts, thread it on. That way it holds it flat against the hub. Now we'll take the caliper bracket, get it in place as carefully as we can without touching the rotor too much. Get the bolt in, kind of find it because the bolt threads into the bracket body itself. It's a good idea to put a drop of blue Loctite on these bolts. Do not use the red Loctite because you'll never ever get these back off. While you're tightening the bolts, try to hold the bracket flat against the steering knuckle so that it doesn't bang against the rotor too much. Torque spec on these bolts is 130 foot-pounds. And that seems high, but that's what the factory specifies. You don't necessarily have to use a torque wrench, but you at least want to use a large breaker bar to tighten these down. However, I do recommend proper torque sequences, and you can usually rent these free of charge from any auto parts store. Before you put the new pads on, I just like to spray down the rotor again one last time. Just take the front pad, slap it on. Now at this point you can untie your caliper. Making sure not to twist or kink the brake hose. Take the rear pad with its spring clip, insert it into the caliper piston. Now make sure the slide pins are all the way out. It just makes the caliper easier to put back on the bracket. Now go ahead and fit the caliper back on. And make sure this brake hose is not twisted or kinked, or make sure it goes back on the exact same way it came off. Now I can start threading in the slide pins. You always want to start this off by hand, never with a tool, because that's how you cross thread things. Once they're threaded in a couple of turns, then you can bring the tool in. Exact torque spec is not terribly important on the caliper slide pin bolts. I just like to do it at least a quarter of a turn past snug. Don't forget the plastic caps. Now it's time to fit this spring clip back on. this point you can go ahead and put the wheel back on. And once you're completely done with both wheels, with the engine off, go ahead and pump the brake pedal up until you get a firm pedal. What that does is it refills the calipers back up with the brake fluid that you displaced when you compressed the pistons back in. This is a very important safety step, because if you don't do this, you'll go to step on the brakes and the pedal will go all the way to the floor and you won't have any pressure.